Meeting come to order, please. First item on the agenda is the reading of the guidance on public input. Public is allowed to speak at public comment after first being recognized by the chair, except that any complaints or comments regarding individually identifiable officers are not allowed. Rather, any such comments or complaints may be provided to the board in writing, and the board will forward such comments or complaint to the appropriate person within the Lawrence Police Department. The board may establish reasonable limits on the allowable length of public comment. As a general practice, the board will not discuss or debate these items, nor will it make decisions on items presented during this time. The next item of the agenda is the minutes from the March 26th meeting. Everybody had an opportunity to read them?
Yes, I move that we accept it.
Any comments or questions on the minutes? Motion is to approve. Was
Motion
made by
to approve, yes.
Dr. Cooper, and second by Dr. Graybill. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We had asked, what was that, May meeting or January?
I think January.
Yeah, about, what is a hypothetical investigation and, what does an investigation look like? Are you providing that?
Yes, sir.
Surgeon?
Yes.
The floor is yours.
I have a couple of, when I say hypothetical, admittedly, I look back at complaints from years past, frankly, many years ago, and it sort of changed and altered some things, but my goal is to give you a general idea of what a complaint looks like. Probably starting off at the beginning, I best say is typically we go wherever the information takes us. And so to sit there and say that every investigation does or does not include this is kind of tough to say, but I'm going to give you a couple examples and hopefully it'll kind of spur some discussion and have some conversations. The first one is involving a traffic stop. Actually, both of these are involving traffic stops. But the chief of police was notified by a community member, and ultimately that community member had received word from somebody else saying, hey, I was stopped by the police, and I believe the stop was racially motivated. So the investigator contacted the driver and ultimately got a statement from the driver. And in interviewing the driver, learned there was also 3 passengers in this car, and again got the names and contact information there. And so in summary, I'll give you what the driver had provided the investigator is he and his friends, which were 3 others, were in a vehicle, and they just left a restaurant on Massachusetts Street. And they had a friend, and he also had then a 5th friend, there's 4 of them, so one, a vehicle behind him with another friend in there. They're southbound on Massachusetts. They had just left a restaurant, windows down, playing music. And then their friend was behind, and the officer had ultimately passed their friend to stop their vehicle. The officer approaches, he looks into the rear passenger compartment with a flashlight, and the driver even tells the investigator, saying the rear passenger was doing something with the seatbelt or cell phone. He's fidgeting around. The officer asks the rear passenger what he was doing and explains his actions. So the officer asks the rear passenger, like, hey, what are you doing? And this rear passenger explains his actions, and the officer then contacts the driver. The officer tells the driver he's getting pulled over because his music was too loud. While the officer is issuing the citation, another vehicle coming from the south had pulled into the parking lot in the area and had very loud music. The driver mentioned the officer is kind of like, hey, why aren't you dealing with this over here? And the officer makes some sort of comment of, hey, we can't get everybody. And also the driver was asked by the investigator in this, could you see who else was in that car? So the driver also said his friend behind him had his music up loud and he was not stopped, and then also expressed frustration because his own personal stereo in his car was just a factory stereo. He's saying it's nothing fancy, doesn't have some sort of boom bass box or anything like that, and he was also frustrated that this officer is inquiring of the actions of the rear passenger. And so ultimately the officer, now granted this isn't scientific because we're not duplicating the same time of day, wind conditions, but goes out and requests the driver out as he in the parking lot has him turn up his radio to the volume he believed it was at the time when he was stopped or traversing Massachusetts Street. The gentleman does that, and the officer takes 2 separate measurements, I believe at 2 different locations, two different stands from the vehicle. He even has the driver with him, and the music can be heard from 125 feet and 150 feet. And also the noise ordinance is anything 50 feet or greater. I'm right on that, right? Does that sound right? Sorry to put you on the spot. So that's, in summary, what the driver provided the investigators. Anybody have any immediate questions on that?
The complaint was made, it wasn't bias-based, or or was it just simply music?
So the reason for the stop was based on the music.
Right.
But the driver's indicating that the officer's identifying his and his passenger's race, and that's also influencing the reason for the contact.
Okay.
Was the car that was also in the parking lot, was that driven by a white or person?
So this driver, and one, you're all kind of assuming who's in the car with the loud music, but as far as race, or probably have pictured who's in there, but referring to the car, and we'll go through that. The driver and all the passenger asks, I think so, and they all have sort of different renditions. It varies between.
I'm talking about the other car that was in the parking lot that was playing the music.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
And so the driver was unable to describe those occupants.
Okay.
So now interview of another passenger, and this passenger is seated behind the driver, and he says, yeah, we're traveling down Massachusetts Street, the windows are down, we're listening to music. Didn't think the music was too loud because the stereo did not have a lot of bass. The officer had pulled around their friend's vehicle and stopped theirs. Officer asked the rear passenger what the passenger was hiding, and the rear passenger advised he was doing something with his phone. The officer then spoke with the driver. This passenger felt like the officer had an attitude, or, was looking for something bad to happen. And then the officer tells the driver why he was stopped and provides some sort of number that this passenger doesn't remember about how far the music can be heard from. And then as the officer is giving a citation, the vehicle pulled into a nearby lot, and officer referenced the loud sound from the vehicle and said, see, we can't get everybody. And then the investigator asked, and this passenger indicated that the drivers, or the occupants of that vehicle were white. Now we're speaking with the front passenger, so the person sitting next to the driver. He once again, yes, we're traveling down Massachusetts Street, windows down, music turned up. Wasn't too loud because of the type of stereo system. Mentioned the driver's friend driving behind them. The officer shined his light in the rear passenger seat and asked the rear passenger what he was doing, and everyone in the car said, so he's saying more, everybody in concert was like, hey, this guy's not doing anything. More than saying that the passenger solely responded by himself. But the officer asked the rear passenger what he was doing, and everyone in the car said they did not have everything, or he did not have anything, or he wasn't doing anything. He also asked about the car that pulled in with the loud music. And actually, let me back up. So this passenger says the Chrysler was driven by a white male, and he was driving into a gas station parking lot. And then the officer also made this comment again of, see, we can't get everybody. So there's obviously some sort of discussion about this other car entering the area. So now for the rear passenger side, and this is going to be the gentleman that was inquired about his actions. He's saying, we're south on Massachusetts Street, and then after the stop, he's made aware of this officer driving around their friend to pull over their car. The officer shined the flashlight in the back seat. He told that he had his phone down on the right side of his leg and was putting his phone in his pocket. The officer, that's what he told the investigator, and the officer had asked him what he was hiding, and he replied he had his phone in his hand. The officer then clarified and said, no, what did you put away? And the rear passenger told the officer he had his phone in his hand the whole time. So the officer, I'm assuming based on this, he brings the attention to the cell phone. The guy acknowledged it, but he believed there was something else involved in the cell phone, so he asked a further question. He says, no, it's just the cell phone. He's done with it. He moves up and contacts the driver. So then they contact the friend behind, and he's like, yeah, I was driving behind him. He drove around my vehicle to stop my friend's vehicle, the vehicle of 4 people. And he couldn't hear the other vehicle because his stereo was loud too. And so ultimately they interview the officer. Bring the officer in, and that night, relevant or not, but he was assigned to a special enforcement car, basically tasked with going out. He wasn't assigned to a district to respond to calls for service, so he was to go out and selectively enforce. He initially observed this vehicle while traveling north on Massachusetts Street here in the 800 block, and he observed the vehicle traveling south. So you can picture he's driving towards City Hall, the vehicle's going this way. All four windows were down, and he heard the loud music. The officer then goes over to New Hampshire Street to ultimately then parallel and then go meet back up with them somewhere. He turns onto 11th Street, and then they meet up now. The officer at 11th of Massachusetts facing west, and the other vehicle is now traversing south. That vehicle goes to the intersection amongst a couple of others. The officer gets in behind. And then once they get to 15th Street, and it turns into 2 lanes, he now drives around those other 2 cars to pull over the car that he initially saw. He mentions noticing the rear passenger doing some sort of movements around the seat. Asked the passenger what he was doing, and the officer recalls the passenger making mention about the seatbelt. The officer said he was no longer concerned and moved on to contact the driver. The officer says he explained the reason for the stop, referring to the loud stereo, and then ultimately when issuing the citation, he describes a black vehicle parked at a liquor store on the other side of the road, and it had a loud stereo. And the officer's mentioning that he pointed out to the vehicle to inform them this violation happens all the time and made a statement to, see, we can't get everybody. And so ultimately, after the driver, which I don't believe the driver was ever aware of this, but after the driver was issued the citation and left, the officer went over to the parking lot to address that situation. And ultimately contacted 2 people who were outside, and they said, we're actually not the driver's inside the liquor store. So the officer counseled them on, hey, keep the music down, and he went about his way. So in general, those were the facts found in this scenario.
So the officer issued a citation to the car,
To the driver.
the lead car to the driver, but not to the follow car, nor to the car that was at the liquor store.
Yes, so the follow car is perceived to be a follow car by the 4 occupants. The follow car, the officer doesn't know about the follow. Does that make sense? He doesn't know that there's this follow car behind them. He sees this car with 4 people in it and the loud music. Ultimately goes and parallels to come contact them later. He has no clue that there's this friend traversing behind. And then,
Parked
yes.
car though, so it goes across the street basically to the
Yes.
parked car that had the loud music,
Yes.
and he didn't wait and give him a ticket?
No. You're getting a little bit dicier there too. He could have, possibly. They're saying that they're the driver. Then, of course, have the driver go, no, I wasn't driving the car. Then you get into this rigmarole over the traffic. So, but he did not.
Is this an actual complaint?
Yes.
Somewhat close to one.
Okay.
I've changed some things too.
Okay.
And
Okay.
But it mirrors one that occurred many years ago.
so, what was the time gap between the incident occurring and the follow-up happening?
The incident referring to observing the car with the,
And then the complaint got registered, and then the...
I don't know. Well, it would have been, I don't know. I didn't pay attention to that.
Okay. And then-
Sometimes, and just speaking in generalities, and this kind of one, as I wanted to bring it up, then you could ask questions. I could talk about what would or would not go into a complaint. One thing is even back to the initial actions of the officer, we have GPS now. And so I'd clearly be able to see this officer driving northbound on Mass, turning over New Hampshire, coming back down to 11th, and then stop. I mean, it would be, and I say that sometimes the GPS glitches, but saying when working, you would be able to clearly prove that. Back to the timing of complaints, sometimes they occur immediately after, or sometimes they don't occur till months. So it truly depends. And that's in general on all complaints. I'm not talking about bias-based policing.
And then the car that was following, the occupant, they interviewed the driver of that car, right?
Uh-huh.
And they said my stereo was too loud, so I couldn't hear anything.
Mhm.
But the police person ignored that, or didn't realize that that was too loud.
I don't want to, I can't speak to that because I don't know, but ultimately he was focused on the initial
Okay.
violation that he observed. He might have even recognized and gone, oh yeah, this car's loud too, but
Fair. Thank you.
No, you're fine, yeah. Any other questions on that one? All right, I have one more.
So can I ask?
Yeah.
What was the resolution?
The officer was exonerated of the complaint. he issued the citation, and that was his. And what you're focused on is and I can read out because I did print this off. Did he unreasonably use the race, age, ancestry, sexual orientation, disability? I'll kind of boil it down. Basically, in making his enforcement decision or his decision to contact these folks, and we couldn't find anything that indicated that. Now we got my.
Dave, I'm assuming that you identified all the identities of the folks, meaning gender, you name it.
Yeah,
on all
I'm just providing the yes.
Only the overt ones. They cannot do orientation and stuff.
Well,
And mind you, what is important too is, and it kind of goes back to when the general was talking to study, is not ultimately what people identify themselves, but what the officer perceives somebody as.
Yes.
What did the officer perceive the race or background of these people that he stopped and cited?
What did he believe their race to be?
Yeah.
He believed them to be African American or black.
And the officer was a different race.
Yes.
And the occupants of the car at the liquor store, or wherever?
One was white and one was black. Any more? I don't mind. I just didn't want to skip ahead if anybody had any questions. Next complaint is the patrol sergeant notifies the investigator about a citizen who wanted to make a complaint and believed that he was racially profiled on a traffic stop. This gentleman here owns a business near 23rd and Haskell and advised this officer in the area of his business driving around trying to intimidate him. Advised the officer followed him to his house near 25th and Iowa and stopped him in his driveway. Advised he was pulled over for not using his turn signal twice. Ultimately, the officer asked for the driver's license and insurance, and the driver acknowledges providing some sort of paperwork. I believe he should have been pulled over after the first violation instead of being followed to his house. The officer also asked for passengers' identification, and he told that the passengers did not. He tells the officer saying, "Hey, my passengers don't need to provide identification." And the officer generally agrees with this, even in the interview, saying, "Yeah, you're correct, but the passenger's not wearing seatbelts, so they need to identify me." Provide their identification or identify themselves to me. And ultimately, the passengers do provide their identification. The driver says the officer called for backup and believed the officer felt threatened because the officer was threatened by his race. Another officer arrives on scene. The officer made some sort of gesture, and the other officer left prior to contacting the officer on scene. Asked if the officer made any mention about the driver's race, and the driver said, "I felt it and believed the officer was trying to find out who I was." The officer ultimately issued a citation for suspended driver's license and no insurance, and did not write for the turn signals of the other passengers wearing their seatbelt. Interview of a passenger, and there's actually two passengers, and all three of these passengers are siblings. The officer pulled the vehicle over. Officer advised the reason for the stop was the driver not using a turn signal. Stated the driver did use a turn signal even while turning into the driveway. Stated the officer had an attitude. Advised this passenger was in the rear passenger seat and was asked for his identification. And he was frustrated because he believed the officer saw him take his seatbelt off when approaching the vehicle. Also advised he had seen the officer near his brother's business at 23rd and Haskell. The investigator asked this passenger, "Hey, do you think the officer did anything wrong?" And he said, "Only the way the officer was talking." The investigator tried to make contact with the third passenger on several occasions, but the third passenger never responded back. So ultimately, the officer is interviewed, and the officer observed turn signal violation in the area where the driver had lived. The officer got behind the vehicle, and the vehicle abruptly turned, which raised the officer's suspicions. The officer catches up to the vehicle, and as it begins to stop the vehicle turns into the driveway. The driver asked the officer saying this, but the driver asked the officer what he had done. The officer introduced themselves and asked for the driver's license and insurance, and informed the driver failed to use the turn signal to block away as well as turning into the driveway. The driver accused the officer of racial profiling, and the officer just repeated the reason for the stop. Also asked for passengers for ID, which the officer states is a common tactic. Some officers have their, I don't want to say idiosyncrasies, but some, they like to ask for ID for everybody in the car. Doesn't mean everybody has to give it. Other officers deal solely with the driver, absent any other safety concern. The driver told the officer they didn't need to provide ID, and the officer, kind of back to what I said earlier, says, no, I agree, but in this situation they do because they're not wearing their seatbelts. The officer issues the citation, and the driver accused the officer of harassing and following him, and the officer told the driver, "Is like I've never stopped you before. I've never seen you before." The driver also accused the officer of stopping his brother in the same car. The officer later checked, because the officer's now going, "Oh, maybe I did, maybe I don't know." The officer checks department resources, databases, etc., and confirmed that the officer's not had contact with any of the occupants of the vehicle or the vehicle itself. The internal affairs investigator also confirmed this as well. The investigator also asked the officer if they were in the area of 23rd and Haskell, and the officer's like, "That's not my area. No, I wasn't over there that day." And so to kind of go, if you remember back, the driver's articulating, the officer makes contact, calls for backup, makes some sort of motion as another officer arrived. Well, a couple things. One is in checking of the call records for the officer is even though the officer says, "I wasn't at 23rd and Haskell," the call log also indicates that the officer was on a car stop in the area, and I think it was 3 minutes prior to stopping the complainant. So it would have been virtually impossible for the officer to have been over 23rd and Haskell. Also, that being said, if we had GPS today, you could quickly rule that out as well. Or if you had GPS, you could quickly rule that out. And listening to the radio traffic as the officer calls out initially in the 2400 block of a street. And then approximately 1 minute later, the officer again is getting on the radio and updating their location. And in no time during any of the radio traffic was the officer requesting any sort of backup. And that is, yeah. And also, I think there's an allegation from the driver about, well, that this officer had seen me wherever and then ultimately just took a different route, met up with me in my address. So ultimately, even the license plate on the vehicle doesn't return to the address where that person was currently living. So if you were to have seen the car, run the tag, and go, "Oh, they live over at 123 Main," well, that address wasn't good on there. And so, to address one other thing is, even in reading this, this hand motion is typical because the officer did not call for backup. Another officer approached, recognizing the officer was in a car stop, which is common to say, "Do you need any help?" This is the high sign saying, "I don't need any help," which then signal for the officer to go on about his or her way. And I did write down a couple other things because I wanted to at least give you an idea of some complaints, and I kind of addressed this, and I don't remember exactly when we got video, even when we got in-car video. It was kind of hit and miss on which cars had it. It was working. Actually, the system started to fail. Then we got a brand new one. It's been fairly robust now. So, absent some issue, we always have in-car video now. There's no absolutes. Things could happen, but the GPS I mentioned has been very helpful to me. And it really helps corroborate. And also, even running stuff on a computer, everything is logged. If you run you run a driver's license, and it even gives times. Everything is time-stamped. Some other things I've used in investigations and related to bias-based policing is officers' key cards. You can prove when they're entering and exiting buildings, and also navigating their way through a building, because some areas, especially at the law enforcement center, there's multiple key card entrance, just because you go to the front doors and you have to do one, so you go upstairs, and when you get upstairs, you have to do another one. So, dispatch traffic, I think that's archived about 6 months, but ultimately radio traffic's helpful. And sometimes also that's important too, to know what the officer's being told. Whether it be in their call notes, which you can pull up, what dispatch is putting over the air, to know what information the officer has prior to arriving on scene or choosing to do some sort of action. And the last, surveillance video is also something that we do seek out. And the only limitation we have is in non-criminal investigations. And I know I said this, but people don't have to give us video unless we get a search warrant. So, and in a non-criminal investigation, you don't have the ability to write a search warrant for an administrative investigation. Go ahead.
In the event you have a complaint and the officer says that his dash cam didn't work, do you have any policies as to verifying the accuracy of that?
Policy, I don't believe so as far as verifying the accuracy. That was something, so ability, probably, but I'm not the tech guy. But I would be calling over to our tech people going, hey, well, let me back up. We had an instance where an officer had a car stop, turned off the camera. When it was over, the person had driven away. But there's still some, not stop the car and then turn off the camera. What about the car stop? But then ultimately we were curious about, I'm trying to think of why we were wondering whether or not the officer turned off we were curious whether or not the officer turned off the camera or if there was some sort of glitch in the system. And we were able to reach out based on the data that produced and reach out to WatchGuard, the company, and they were able to say with 100% certainty that the off button was pressed. So is it in policy where it says you shall go do this if this is reported to you by an officer? No, but that would be something we would do. Because that would be obviously, that would raise great concerns. I've yet to, most times the fail in-car video is, it's never pointed in the direction you want it to be in, because it's going like this, and there's actually sometimes it has this panoramic, so sometimes you'll get stuff caught on the very side of it, and then the audio, it's limited to the mic pack that's on the officer's belt, and so they could go into a building where that almost immediately ceases, or even just certain distances, and I get these annoying clicks and all that, so, but as a general rule, when a car stop occurs, and it all occurs right in front of the camera, you can hear everything, but you can hear, now, granted, no other officers showing up on scene, sometimes you can't always hear them on the same mics, etc.
Well, actually, my question was more directed toward to verify whether the officer actually saw this car not make the turn signals.
Oh, okay. No, that's a good question. So, this isn't an absolute because sometimes it might take a minute or two, but when the recording starts, it does a 30-second look. So when I go to watch, you go pull over a car tonight, and I go to watch that car stop, it will actually start 30 seconds before the camera's activated, but within those 30 seconds, there is no audio. The audio doesn't start until you activate the camera system. Also, though, there is the ability, and I don't know the retention on it, and it's merely, it's not a retention schedule like in policy, but basically how much the hard drive can hold. But let's say an officer is doing a car stop now at 7:30 p.m. At 11 p.m., or officer doing some sort of action. We get a complaint and a concern, and the video was not on. We can go back and do what's called a recording after the fact. And if I remember correctly, though, it's only going to have the video and no audio.
The video and what?
If we were to go back and retroactively record something,
Yes.
which we have the ability to do for a certain time frame until it gets overridden, it would be just the video and not the audio.
Oh.
I think. I don't think the audio would be present.
And that capability is 8 hours, 12 hours?
That I don't know. I think our tech people could answer all those questions.
So basically, this is an always-on camera, and you hit to...
It is. It is always on, but of course, there's limitations. You can't store everything forever.
Yeah.
So it begins to overwrite. But yes, it is. And I believe, ultimately, when the body cameras are implemented, it would be a similar type deal where when they're activated, it would have some sort of look back. There's actually a term for it, I forget it. And then the audio would kick on. But also you could go back and pull off stuff that wasn't technically recorded.
I have one question. You found 2 examples of people being, like the cops being exonerated. Were you able to find any examples where like it was a valid complaint and what that looked like and what was the...
I would have loved to have presented one of those to you. We do not have any of those.
Okay.
And so we have typically 1 or 2 a year, sometimes 0. And so I pick these, and I get it somewhat self-serving. I pick these because it's typically a not sustained or exonerated. And because there was a little bit of some nuance involved and a little bit of investigative work. Of course, I was not the one that investigated them, so I can't speak to everything, but just to give you a general idea of what we can and can't do.
So back to your point about exonerated, what could the complainant have done better to set it up?
I don't think there's any, I wouldn't place any fault or concern on the complainant. I think a lot of what's very tough is the complainant has a feeling.
Veracity of their comments?
What's that?
How about veracity of their comments? That what
The
they're
truthfulness?
saying? Yes.
So, I guess in complaints in general, of course, if they're telling you something and about 60% of what they're telling you, you're proving it's like, this didn't happen. I'm not talking about bias-based policing, just in general. It's like, you kind of tend to don't believe much of what they're telling you. So I guess you determine the truthfulness when people tell you something and then you go, oh yeah, this occurred. But many times we're not debating whether or not the traffic stop occurred, these aren't whodunits. They're not going, some officer did something to me and figure it out. They're saying, this officer stopped me, they wrote me a ticket, and they did this because of, and it's, when I say it's a feeling, I'm not saying it's an invalid feeling, but it's a feeling. But then to go and prove and have an officer, say, oh, I pulled this person over because of this reason or that reason. And every time they've talked about some sort of legitimate law enforcement reason. I'm talking about in our internal investigations.
Of the occupants in the car, was there any history with any of those to the law enforcement department?
I don't think so, because just knowing, no. On the last one, I do believe they're now more familiar to us than they were at the time. So.
How much, I know that you said that there was a second person account when the first one was reported, like they complained to someone else who eventually complained to the proper authorities.
Sure.
How much time lapsed with the second one? Is lapsed time kind of one of the biggest problems where people wait too long or?
No, no.
Okay.
Now, with the only limitations to lapse time is merely things might be lost. The video could ultimately be purged. Dispatch traffic could be purged. And this is all within our retention policy. There's nothing nefarious. It's just like, hey, I can't find this traffic stop occurred over a year ago. So, but no, sometimes, typically, most complaints come in within a relatively close time frame of when the incident occurred. But sometimes, I had one come in January over something that occurred last September. It's just some, there's, and also, and even when I get into the annual report, is there's also a delay in investigation should there be an active court proceeding. So, sometimes, and I've even had where people will come in, they're frustrated about it, and one gentleman even made mention about, kind of like, man, this ticket went away, I'd go away too. And so, we don't, as a general, we do not actively investigate until court is over. And so with that being said though, I will recognize that this complaint exists and I will go in and start to preserve everything to make sure we have all the information when it's time to do the investigation. We just don't say, oh, well, if it disappears, it disappears. No, it's nice to have, I love video, audio, etc. It's an advantage.
Do the public actually know that they can complain about police activity?
It's on our website. People do, I believe, have found this information because my phone, I do get calls. So I think the answer is yes.
So
But that's not really we get complaints, and so I don't.
How many complaints a year do you get?
So as far as, we investigated 16 full, what I would call OPA, Office of Professional Accountability. I'd have to go back, because even many go to patrol, but it's service level stuff like, hey, they put the wrong information in my accident, they have a street wrong in my accident report, or even rudeness complaints typically aren't handled unless it's like a repeated performance issue. So, but we had 16 complaints that were investigated last year.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Is it on a prominent spot on the website? Like, I don't want to pull up my computer.
No.
Is it a prominent spot? Or so
Lawrence
it's
KS.
Complain here, click here to complain.
Yeah, no, it does not say click here to complain. It's lawrenceks.org/police, and then it shows up, and I believe you click feedback,
Okay.
and then it tells you how, and it also it outlines our compliments, complaints. We get more complaints than compliments, and then it also outlines bias-based policing, and even has the annual report, which I'm going to talk to you about later as well.
Go ahead. Yes.
I'm going to apologize in the event that this has already been explained in another.
No, you're fine.
But what safeguards do you have within the department to hopefully guarantee objectivity, unbiased by investigating yourselves?
Yeah, I get the question because there is this appearance. So the one particular to bias-based policing, And I've dealt with 2 of these complaints, and you will hear me on recording go, you are more than welcome to contact the Attorney General's office. And actually, in my preference, and I know even I can speak for the Chief of Police, it would be our preference that they do not have the Lawrence Police Department investigate these. Both times, the complainants have chosen to interact with me. I even go as far as I bring them the complaint form to fill it out through the Attorney General's office. So,
Yeah, and I'm just thinking of that in terms of, you know, just really not even having to raise that question, right? So, and so in that, if you are doing the investigation, so once again, what safeguards? I'm going to guess that has something to do with training, protocols, oversight, third-party oversight? What
Sure.
kinds of things
So,
exist to?
a complaint in general, once again, so the Attorney General's office, and I think they investigate complaints of bias-based policing, should somebody contact them. Because I even asked, I even called them up and said, what if somebody calls and complains on this matter to me? Can I just forward the complaint to you? Basically, to eliminate that. So back to the safeguards we do have in place. We do have training. We do have policy. I complete a report that is then reviewed then by my captain, that is then reviewed by the chief. Also, the chief then, I can't speak for every conversation he has with the city manager, but I know he keeps, as far as his third party, somebody outside the police department. And many times legal's aware of these complaints as well. And I think Maria's read a good bulk of but the chief briefs the city manager, I think orally through as complaints come in, and then annually he presents them a sort of a detailed synopsis of each complaint. I get the optics,
Yeah.
and this isn't in paper, but I can tell you, I kind of feel it's like when if I was a coach of my kid's team, you feel this obligation not play your kid. It's like I get the optics, and my job is to find the truth, to find the facts. But I understand I understand how it appears. But all I can tell you is my goal is to do the right thing, and I believe that's been fairly
And
consistent
that's not
with
a question.
I know.
Please no.
No, I don't. I know that wasn't a personal, but I get the optics of it,
Yeah.
and that's a common deal of the police
Yeah.
investigate themselves.
Yeah.
It's kind of one of those deals because the police investigate themselves, and I know it has poor optics, but there is a reality behind it, and
Is there some place where it could be more proactive? For example, I was thinking especially in biracial interactions, this is for bias-based policing.
Sure.
Could they clip on a sheet if you thought something was amiss, this is where you can go. Make it a little more proactive.
Are you saying? Explain. I'm sorry.
So I'm writing you a ticket for loud music. On top of that, I staple a sheet which says, if you think the policeman, I didn't behave properly with you, here's a place you can go.
I'm sure that has not been thought of.
Because that will encourage people to quickly evaluate, and maybe you'll get complaints quicker. Because I don't know if that's practiced today, but earlier, and I haven't gotten a ticket in many years now. So when you got a ticket, the officer said, you have until this day to pay it off. So if they are going to say that, can they say, here's
I do
a
know
chance
that if
for
an
you.
officer is inquired, typically if anybody demands to speak with the supervisor on scene, of course the officer will get a supervisor out right there. It does not preclude the officer from taking the law enforcement action they were seeking out. But as far as proactively stapling the tickets information, that's not currently done, and that's not been thought about. I can't say that would be something we would do. I'd have to take that back to the boss on that one.
And nothing like that's printed on the ticket.
No.
Because at this point, as a person, if I were not here, I would not know that I can complain. And if I don't know that I can stand up and complain against a police officer. I don't think many in the community know that.
Any other questions?
So those are a couple scenarios. Do you want me to move on to the next one?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Item number 4.
So, Annually, we have to submit this report by July 31st, and I believe you folks have a draft copy of the report. And so in summary, how it's actually done is you go in and fill in some drop-down boxes on the Attorney General's website, you click submit, and then it generates this, I'm going to say PDF, I don't think it's a PDF, but it generates this report. So actually, I will probably go and do this tomorrow to just make sure. I would have done it already if I didn't have to present it first, so I will go and do this tomorrow. But even as I go and click send, it's not immediately available. It goes through some sort of process on the back end. But then if you go to the Attorney General's website and you search for Lawrence, and then they have the links for all of our annual reports, and you click on it, and it will present something. So this is my rendition of the report in the sense of I tried to find similar fonts, and it looks, and even I have a copy of the year prior, just to show you that I'm not joshing you on this. But with that being said, with that being said, your copy does not have this right here, but I think will be self-explanatory because I do not want to sit and just type all this out, and it's just really sort of a disclaimer, etc. But this is the year prior.
Right.
So most of this will be self-explanatory with a couple clarifications. So first, the reporting period, we have July 1st, 2018 to then June 30th of this year. The number of complaints is 1. And the only thing I want to address on that is, if you notice the time gap of this reporting in September of 2018 was not resolved till May of this year, that was because court. It finally got dealt with, I think, around, April. March or April. And there's also limitations, too, sometimes on my schedule, the officer's schedules, etc., so they take time. Number 1, have all law enforcement officers serving in the agency who are not exempted from annual training by the Commission on Police Standards and Training completing training required in KSA 224610. Our answer is yes. And so on that, we have provided 3 trainings that would meet this requirement. I've vetted and I was very proactive. I even provided, you send out a training. It's an online, the online KLAPC one, which I know sounds sort of disingenuous. It's actually a very good training. It takes a good 2 or 3 hours. But I even created false deadlines to make sure we got this done prior to July 1st. But every commissioned officer that's currently on this department has taken this training, so hence why we can mark yes. And many of others, then we have a cadre of employees that also teach bias-based policing, and a good bulk, if not almost all, the officers in our most recent in-service training have received in-person training. And then the city this year, and I'm not even, had also provided some online training. And a lot of that was more based around it wasn't necessarily specific to bias-based, but like even the American with Disabilities Act and sort of the laws surrounding these things. Does the agency have a policy prohibiting racial or other bias-based policing? The answer is yes. I have provided at the first meeting, and really our policy mirrors the model policy that's provided by the Attorney General's office. Does the agency mandate specific discipline for sustained complaints of racial or other bias-based policing? The answer is yes on that. I don't know if you brought our policy. It's on page 4, but it mirrors the model policy that the Attorney General has. And even there was an email that came out today, which basically says they were letting everybody know that fills out this form. If you answer yes, that because you have to have the model policy, then you should be answering yes on number 3 as well. With that being said, even though it talks about really, you have to take into account labor contracts, resolution ordinances, but discipline could include suspension and or termination. I very much summarized that. Does anybody want to read what the punishment would be?
That's the same one you gave us.
Page 4, right?
Yep.
Top of page 4.
Yep. Does the agency have a racial or other bias-based policing community advisory board? We can now answer yes.
But last year also you answered yes.
If I did, then that was an error.
Okay.
Oh wait, no, we had the other one that was still active. I apologize.
So that's what I was wondering.
So here is what's going to require a little bit of explanation. Does the agency have a racial or other bias-based policing comprehensive plan? In years past, we have answered yes. and it was under sort of false understanding of what that question was asking. And even though I know it says comprehensive, which to me seems vast, big, or large, or kind of all-encompassing, the thought process is we provide ongoing information on how to provide complaints on our website, and we meet what's required of the Attorney General's office to have on our website about complaints. That thought process is incorrect. That has nothing to do with the comprehensive plan. We were wrong. What that does have to do with, and actually I brought a copy of the statute. Do you just want to talk about it? No? Okay. Do you have it? I brought everybody a copy. And I'll explain because it's just a bunch of So, I prefer not to have to read this line by line. But the things is really what this boils down to is the governing body of a city or the sheriff of the county, so we're a municipality or city, can ultimately enact this comprehensive plan, and that it would need to include the following, and it's 1 through 7. And then it gets into all this other stuff beyond that has to do with data collection. So just to kind of more draw your attention to B and then 1 through 7. And so many of these we would have, but ultimately would require the governing body, which I'm assuming the commission, to formalize some sort of comprehensive plan.
I can speak to. So the attorney from the Attorney General's office that spoke to you on your first night, she provided training, an overview on the law on racial or other bias-based policing, but she also has another segment of training on comprehensive plans. It helps agencies develop them and what needs to be included in best practices. And I contacted her today and asked if that training is still available, and she said, yes, we can make a request to her, and her office will review it, of course, and then be happy to provide it. So if you are interested, after discussion in developing a comprehensive plan in the future, then I think that might be a good resource for us to contact on how to set it up in the best way.
And then lastly, do we currently collect extra pedestrian or traffic stop data pursuant to the racial and other bias-based policing statute? The answer is no, but next year it will be yes. But we're talking about this current or most recent training year. So that is the report we submit annually. And go ahead.
Sergeant Ernst, have you done any comparison between, say, Saline County or Reno County or any other counties, how they stack up against the number of complaints that were processed?
I've not done Saline or Reno County.
And I just point them out because they're cities of comparable size there.
What I have done, I wouldn't comparable, I have Wichita's, Olathe's, Overland Park's, and Lenexus, and in not in this reporting period, because mind you, those aren't available yet,
Yeah.
but Wichita had 1, Olathe had 3, Overland Park had 3, and Lenexa had 2. And then also they answered, Lenexa also answers no to the comprehensive plan. That was just a random smack. It was my brain randomly selecting cities around here, so you can take that first. I don't know. Oh, it doesn't?
So I was just commenting that if a complaint from a complainant in Lawrence were to go to the Attorney General's office, it wouldn't show up on our annual report. It's a record of the Attorney General, so some of those cities might have received more complaints, but it wouldn't show up on their report.
And I might just clarify the reason why we're providing this to you in a draft before it's been submitted, because that's in line with what the ordinance requires. So that's the reason why there's a draft for you.
For review?
Yes.
And then do we vote to accept it?
It just indicates that the report should be presented to the board prior to the submission to the Kansas Attorney General. I don't think it hurts for you to make a motion to receive the report and any other comments that you may have for the report.
So I have a quick question, and I should know this in terms of the racial mix of our police officers. And I ask this question because you mentioned that you do lectures on bias-based policing. So and officers do. Who are typically the officers?
Who are the officers? I can think of a few. We have Sergeant.
Race-wise, gender-wise means I'm looking at it
You
from
know what?
the.
I can get that information. I don't.
And if it is,
Are you talking about looking at, like, for example, what the demographics look like for our diverse law enforcement force?
yes, and who does the classes?
Sure.
So
You
bias-based
want
policing.
the
Oh, okay.
department breakdown of race and gender, and then the who teaches the classes.
Yeah, on whatever the bias-based policing demographics or categories.
So just a real quick question based on this, is there an existing recruitment plan to make sure that at minimum, or any policy that says at minimum, the law enforcement workforce should reflect the same percentage as the demographic of the?
Sure. Yes, but that has all been sort of thwarted, and now our current recruitment plan is we need to get qualified people in the door, period. Many of times, we can't even fill the spots that we have open. So it's,
Yeah, and all I'm thinking is, because I kind of like data.
Sure.
Is that if you set, something where at least you met the percentage ratio, and if you exceeded it, that would be like clap, that would be something.
are you talking about current employees or?
A recruitment plan to identify the existing.
And target
existing
composition.
percentage and how it mirrors the existing population. Are we there? And that could be one aspiration, at least to get there.
Sure.
And then another certainly could be to work to best practice exceed it,
Sure.
And that would be, and again, because these seem like protected classes, there might be some people out, there might not be some people out, and do you really want, a law enforcement officer to present themselves in their, sexual orientation, gender identity, or whatever? Hopefully so, if they're comfortable, but I don't know. I don't know these things.
What was your last statement? I know we were able to get the race and gender demographics with the department. Beyond that, I don't believe we would have that information. As far as the recruitment plan, and this is kind of being repeated, is really, we have even somewhat, there's probably a better term, but lessened the testing requirements to get more people into the, not like it used to be, it used to be that you take this test, and if you fail the math section, you were done. You weren't moving on. Does this make sense? So now we've taken the test and averaged scores over the entire test. That is the lessening of the requirements. We're not like hiring felons and stuff like that. So,
Are you having almost the same problem the military's having, where people are kind of just overweight, not finishing high school, probably psychiatric problems, the medications that they're taking,
So-
there's a smaller pool of people who are eligible, and then just based off competitive salaries, it's even harder to get people who want to serve in that capacity? Is that mostly the issue?
I would, a few things. One, the economy's strong right now.
Yeah.
I don't know about the overweight high school, but we have a lot of stuff, lifestyle choices made leading up to applying for the police department and even these aren't discretionary items on our part. It's dictated by CPOST, what you can and can't do. And so a lot of times people's, their past, they've done things that would prohibit them from becoming a police officer. And this is probably more anecdotal, but also the political climate of being a police officer now. It's not appealing to many, and so people aren't applying. So even in my time, this is rough numbers, we might get 300 applicants, over 300 applicants for a hiring pool. We're now down to about 100. And that sounds like a lot of applicants, but many of those people just already, they're not. Just because you have 100 applicants does not mean, so I know people perceive like you're sitting and looking at, do we choose this person or that person? It's quite the opposite.
This person's not eligible, this person's not eligible, maybe.
Yeah.
If I can interject, I think we're going past the purpose of the board here because, we're talking about performance, we're talking about what happens or doesn't happen, and regardless of the makeup of the police, the standards of police conduct are the same. whether it's that or gender. I think it's a great thing that can be discussed, but I'd suggest maybe
I don't
after the
know.
meeting.
Yeah, I don't,
It kind of goes hand in hand when you think about
Does
it, like not to
Yeah.
go back to the military, like when they lowered the standards during the war, you had more incidents of like people not acting correctly, and if they're lessening the standards, that might.
Yeah, no,
Go across
so
the
when I
board.
said that in Ukraine's like, no, we're not lowering in the sense of, the same lifestyle, but, you know, drug use, all those things, that has not been altered, so. But, you know, also, I will add, I will go back, kind of maybe addresses a couple inquiries about us investigating ourselves, et cetera. Of our 16 complaints that were investigated, 12 of those were generated internally.
Okay.
So we tell on ourselves. But, you know, so,
in terms of holding yourselves accountable.
yeah, and back to the standard, so we still hold ourselves to a high standard. Just would be nice to have more people to hold to a high standard.
Yeah.
We'll follow up with some reports though on the race and gender of officers within the police.
That question gets asked from time to time, so that we
It's a
can use
nice
it.
background.
And those who are doing the training, and then compared to the community as a whole.
Is there a motion to accept the
I am fine.
acknowledged receipt of the draft report?
Yes. I move.
Class up on them.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
No opposed? If nobody has any objection, Sergeant, are you providing this follow-up on the LGBTQ training as well?
Essentially, yes and no. The memo speaks for itself.
Yeah.
Yes.
But with that being said, I just want to have one addition, and I'll provide you folks the memo. Is the chief also is working on identifying an LGBTQ liaison from the department. And so I was going to show you all that, provide that memo to you. And I'll give one to that one too. As far as what the chief envisions with this, I know it's not specific to training, but I'd argue it's on topic, so.
And the memo, as you say, speaks for itself.
Well, in the sense of, yeah, I guess,
It does. It says what training and.
Moving on to item 5 on the annual report. Has everybody had an opportunity to read the annual report?
Fair enough. Good.
The draft annual report?
This one? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the one that
It looks very
full
nice.
color, if you've seen it
Yeah.
on the website.
So on page 2, would that be the 2018-19 year in the first paragraph? Then it formed in 2018?
Oh, yes,
Okay, just,
I see it. Typo.
Are there any other comments or questions on the annual report?
I would move that it be submitted as we have it, with the exception of one time.
I say.
Is that to say correct the typo and submit?
Yes.
did you get both of them? Okay,
Both of
Yes,
them.
I got one.
okay.
There was two.
The September, I think that should be September 17th, 2018.
Yes, sorry.
That's
I'm
okay.
famous at doing that.
I used to rage too much.
Presuming that it's corrected, is there a motion to approve the report as amended? There is that's right, there is a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
And thank you for putting that together.
Yes.
The next item on the agenda is the chairman's remarks, and When I was preparing for this meeting, since it's my last, especially, but since it's also the last meeting of the fiscal year, et cetera, it struck me that it's all well and proper that the annual report should talk about completed actions. And because if you talked about planned or proposed items, by the next time the board meets, there'll be a new chair, but there'll also be, and possibly, maybe other members of the board, but also circumstances may change their, and the chair and the members of the board might want to go somewhere else. So I agree with the whole idea that the annual report is looking back. So I made these remarks from the idea of sort of looking forward. And I do think that we've accomplished a lot. It's not always easy to sit and look line by line and compare the bylaws, the ordinance, and do all of that. But you members of the board have really done a good job in pitching in and paying attention to the details, including getting the years right. No, I'm saying that in all honesty, kudos. So those are my remarks. If you look down, or the reason I just think it's appropriate, just like we have been doing for the year, we don't have any complaints to review. We've been looking at training. We've been asking questions about policies. We've been looking at our own policies. So in that review, I think, as it says, I think we're fortunate that we have an effective police force. And based on the lack of complaints, we generally have the support of the citizens of Lawrence. But I don't think that we as the board, and especially in the absence of action to look at complaints and I don't think we should be sitting passively. I think we ought to be looking at things that could be perhaps more proactive and continue to look in and ask questions about the state of police-community relations and look at avenues in which the relations could be improved. So with all that aside, there's a couple recommendations here. When we talked to Sergeant Rhodes, we asked a number of questions about how did you did all this fantastic outreach, but how did you ensure that you were reaching minority communities? And one of the things that we discussed then, and I wanted to put this in writing, was to make a recommendation that the outreach program get further strengthened by identifying the minority centers of influence. And the chief's memo here obviously is doing just that, about looking for a representative, and reach out and invite the participation from these centers, churches, civic groups, community organizations, etc., to invite their participation and provide them with opportunities to, give the police their viewpoints and also consider whether it might be appropriate at some point in time to have a representative from the groups to talk about to the Community Police Review Board from the standpoint of things that a particular group might consider important, and regardless of what the record might be in terms of complaints, it would provide an opportunity for them to express their concerns. Another thing that made a large impression on me was when we went through the training and there was the demonstration in the training facility over on Bob Billings, and the firing, and we watched the videos, etc. I do not think that the public has any real appreciation of and I'm not speaking for the police, I'm speaking of my observation, but I don't think the public has any idea that the average police officer walking up to a car has no idea what's going to do, and given open carry, concealed carry, large magazines, I don't think the average, I think the average policeman is a little bit on edge. And that's not casting criticism on the police officer. It's just a fact. We watched a couple of those stops that obviously they were in the minority, but I don't think people in the community understand how they may or may not inadvertently trigger suspicion or apprehension on the part of the police. And again, I think that this is something I think the police could, in the outreach they do, or discussing particular minority groups or the like, I think that they can, this could something be discussed with the group. You know, how does the police, how would you feel, for example, that nobody likes to get a traffic stop, but how would you like the police officer to put you at ease when he or she walks up to your car? On the other hand, would you like to know how you can put the police officer at ease? Don't want to belabor it, but the second part of it is, I want to follow up with something that's been discussed a couple of times, and I think, I don't know what the structure exactly of it should be, but I think there should be a Citizens Academy that could provide a similar kind of observation. Watch the training films, watch the reaction time that an officer would have to do, and that could be one. Ride-alongs, all of those kind of things, but I think that I think that I would recommend the city and the police department consider that. Lastly, there's some topics from other meetings I thought would be worthwhile for follow-up in the next meetings, as chair would choose. One is body cameras. They're coming. What's the status of them, and how are they going to, how's the data going to be kept? How are they going to impact the idea of they should help, but what's the expected impact of that? I wonder if there in fact are lessons learned about the recent mass shooting in Massachusetts Street that, just got finished trials. I think that it would be appropriate, for example, especially since the chief of police is now looking at finding a representative to the LGBT. I'll get it.
PQ?
Yeah.
PK?
Yes. Thank you.
Keeps going.
He's crying.
Yeah, I'm tongue-tied at the moment, but anyhow, the point is, he's got a good an opportunity there. I think perhaps it would be good, especially since the chief and his board work for the city manager, that perhaps the chief might want to provide his overview. And then finally, again, and adding to this, I would say perhaps the bias-based comprehensive plan training. Obviously, we're not going to write it, but basic information on that. So that's sort of my overview and looking ahead, which I wrote so that it sort of, to me, brings all of our efforts and everything full circle.
I think this is well done, so thank you for doing it.
The one thing I can quickly address, if anybody wants to go on a ride along, please let me know. I can get you in a patrol car pretty quick, but I would wait till school starts back up. So, but there's always the curse of the ride along. I've only had one good ride along in the sense of where I had somebody with me, and it was actually an exciting night. So,
And Tony, I think you've done a marvelous job. I know when we were starting out, we knew nothing about this. I don't know why we volunteered, but I think we've put a lot of structure around it, thanks to your leadership. And Tanya, thank you for being the vice president. So it does. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I still live here, yes.
Mr. Chair, thank you for preparing this. I was just going to make a suggestion. I think it may be helpful if the board wishes to talk about any of these things, or if you wish to, eventually make a recommendation in the form of a motion that then can be formally transmitted either to the commission or the police department. I think that would be really helpful.
How about
For
with
consideration, yeah.
Yes.
Well, the question was that's what it is. It's nothing more than some recommendations. Do we need a motion basically to put this into the minutes?
Yes.
Well, yes, what I think that would be appropriate is for the board as a whole to put in the form of a motion how you wish to transmit this in the form of a recommendation. And I think that would be really helpful. So in other words, if you wanted to transmit the entire thing, to make a motion accordingly so that it is on record that the entire board agrees with the comments from the chair.
As they say in the Senate, I would read it into the minutes. So this becomes part of the minutes.
Why wouldn't we just treat this like the other report and just make a motion to accept or receive it?
That could certainly be part of it, to receive it. If you wished to pass it on as a recommendation of this board, the appropriate way to do that is to put that in the motion as well, and then it can be formally transmitted. And I'll make sure that the city commission would receive it as well. But I want to make it clear that it's the action of the board as a whole.
And my only comment to that is that I think a lot of these things deserve more discussion than 10 minutes to decide whether we're going to approve.
Oh, I don't.
That's
I agree
entirely
with that
up to
wholeheartedly.
that's entirely
But,
up to this board.
How about receive it as a report and transmit the recommendations for further consideration by at the next meeting? And then the chair and the members of the board can say, okay, well, we can look at this a meeting from now or 2 minutes from now, or pay no attention to them. So, does that receive it and
I
forward the
guess what I'm
recommendations?
saying is if you need a unanimous approval of this, you're not going to get it from me tonight.
I don't think we would be unanimous.
Well, that's all I'm saying. I think we should receive it, consider it.
So,
Yeah, that, receive it and forward it for consideration at future meeting.
Somebody make a motion.
what my point would be, if we want to make, I would accept the document as it comes. And what actionable items flow from here? If we want to put this in the form of recommendations, I'd like to have the counsel of the author. And next time we meet, Tony is not going to be there, right, Tony? At this point,
I'm
means
no longer,
technically,
this is my
Technically.
end of my term.
yes. So that would put us at a disadvantage if you miss the author, what they had in mind.
I think I'll take it on Bill's side. I think we're making this overly complicated. I think for your consideration, I would say a recommendation to receive the report and recommend and provide the recommendations for future study by the board.
That's good.
So I guess I just made the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Now, I would like to speak to the outreach program, if I may, since you kind of went through them all. And I just kind of get the board up to speed that I actually spoke to Sergeant Ernst prior to the meeting, knowing that after the last couple of meetings that we've talked about the opportunities after hearing a great report that they provided from 2018's engagement about some opportunities for marginalized groups. So I have taken it upon myself to go meet with a number of people in the community, in the LGBT community. And so I have two people that would love to be liaisons. Jay Pryor is number one. He's on the Human Relations Commission. He's transgender. And then Diane Silver, who is a very important person in this community. She's president of the Unity Church, and what have you. So I provided the contact information to certain members, and they would like to start with me as well, having a conversation. We don't know, this is just the start. It's the start of maybe one side of it, we talked about getting engagement started, and the other side, which is so important, is helping with training for marginalized groups, for the LGBTQ and the transgender specifically. So I wanted to kind of give you, as the board, because you don't know that I've been kind of up to this, working on it, because I think we need to start somewhere. And they asked for it. So.
I think that's great. I'm alarmed on the national level about, what's happening to transgender folks everywhere and the death rates. That's like extremely concerning to me, and what that represents in terms of how comfortable people feel in their own communities, and I want people to feel comfortable in this community, all people, of course. But I think right now, I'm very concerned about that.
I'll give you a little bit of insight because Jay is very engaged with this community and has for years. Apparently, Jay's in conversation with Tony Wheeler potentially to do training with all city employees, including the police department, on transgender. I asked him to maybe consider that to kind of segue with LGBTQ as well, get the whole thing in there. But we talked about maybe giving some time within the police academy, if it's an hour or two, whatever that may be, into the high points of the training of the city and the police department. So I think that's kind of where we're starting. And the engagement is maybe having kind of a coffee shop kind of a thing, and start off with half a dozen of the officers and half a dozen of LGBTQ and transgender, and starting an engagement and kind of grassroots and starting from there. So you all have ideas. We have the opportunities with outreach, so start kicking those ideas out.
I think that's very positive, and the only thing I would note is that in addition to that community, there are minority ethnic communities, etc.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that stops any of us from suggesting these people talk to Sergeant Ernst or Sergeant Rhodes about asking for that kind of conversation over a cup of coffee. We do not have, as near as I can see, a need for a July 17th meeting. Is there a motion
Motion to abandon it.
to cancel?
Then
Second,
All in favor?
Aye.
on the second part that you had in here, I was just going to coming back at you. So
Oh, sorry.
on
Sure.
the Citizens Academy, I know we had been talking about, and I know police department was working on maybe that this year, or
So if I recall, in our last meeting, it was talked about late summer. Truly, since our last meeting, I've not heard anything about it. So my answer is I don't know. But I don't know what the timeline is on that now.
and that's been,
Really, like I said, we were talking, and I heard you say Citizens Academy. I was like, I know she's going to ask me when that is now. All right.
We'll follow up on it and
Okay.
provide you all a report.
a couple of years, correct, the police department can,
I don't know. I'll include that in the report.
I think it's been more than 2, yes.
I'm just curious, if that's a funding thing or why that is.
I don't know why it went away, but yeah, it's just, it's been a few years, about 3 or 4, I think.
Absent any other comments, is there a motion to adjourn?